Hi, Mrs. Cheney here to talk to you guys about Egyptian art. We're going to be looking at relief pieces and sculptural pieces, and we're going to tie this into a project that we're going to be doing in class. So without further ado, I'm going to go right into the history part of this. Some of these images you saw the other day when we were discussing them without your information, and you gave your feelings about them. So the first one that I want to talk about, or what I want to talk to you about more than anything, is the sculpture of palettes, okay? So palettes were used in Egypt to hold makeup, so that eye makeup, as you can see the image of the Egyptian in the bottom right-hand corner, was worn so that reflections of the sun would not hurt their eyes. Kind of like baseball players and football players do today. You know, they smear the black paint, the black eye makeup underneath their face so that when the sun comes down, it doesn't reflect off of that. Black absorbs light instead of bouncing off of it into their eyes. And so Egyptians wore a lot of it around their eyes. And scholars believe that this stone that was found was used to hold eye makeup. Well, instead of this stone or this palette to hold just makeup, they thought, why don't we make this pretty as well? And so an artist created carvings on both sides of it. On both sides of this stone or this palette, they're decorated. So here's the front side and the back side. Why one is gold and one is dark, I don't know. It was an image I found on the internet, and it was the only one that I found where it was side by side so you could see it. And it probably just had to do with lighting. But what this is called is the palette of Narmer. So you need to write this down in your sketchbook so that you can have a little bit of information to refer back to when we have a quiz. Here's a little disclaimer before I keep going. There is a site that will be shared with you soon, a slide, a PowerPoint presentation where there's a lot of images to go through, and you're gonna have to click, 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 and there's a lot of YouTubes. Know that you're gonna be responsible for information in those little videos. The videos are like a minute long, 2 minutes long, tiny. Some of them look kind of childish, but I liked how they explained the Egyptian art to you a little bit better than a documentary would. So know that you are responsible for the information not only in these notes, but also in those slides, because you will be having a quiz on this information. So I know you've been writing and hopefully listen to me at the same time. This was found in 1898 by an archaeologist, and it is now in a museum in Egypt. And both sides of it are decorated. I want you to look at this and know that, you know, in painting class, you guys use a palette to hold all of your paints. So an artist created this to hold the eye paint. And in the very center of the one on the right-hand side here, you can kind of see the well. And it is assumed that that is where they mixed the pigment to be used in the palette, or to be used on the eyes. Okay? And here is one side of the palette. And it is called the palette of Narmer because this dude here standing in the middle is King Narmer. And if you look closely to it, I'm going to move myself because I'm not that important, but if you look closely on the right-hand side, the little cartoon illustration, you have a picture of a king, a pharaoh, and he is holding like a baton in his hand, and he's going down and he's going to hit this poor man in the head or the body with it. And it is representational of King Narmer conquering Egypt, kind of like he's conquering this man, the enemy. To the left of Narmer here is his servant and or slave holding his sandals. I want to point out that this Egyptian is standing barefoot and on this land. It is known to be, or considered to be, sacred land, and that is why he is barefoot. Just like during biblical times, you know, they talked about how Egypt walked, or how Jesus walked on sacred land, and the land he walked on became sacred because of him. He walked on the land. So it's kind of the same comparison. Whether or not you're religious or Christian or not doesn't matter. It just has to do with the fact that he is standing on sacred land. And that is why his shoes are removed. Before I go on, these palettes, or this palette, is divided into sections. And these sections are called registers. So at the top, you have a register of these two bulls. The middle section, you have the king, his servant, his enemy. And then the bottom section, you have two more enemies that are laying down on the ground dead. Okay? Here is another one. And what's really crazy and interesting about all of this on this side is you have, this is King Narmer's, like a pharaoh, or what do you want to say? This bull up the top represents King Narmer. I can't talk. And then in the center here, this is his name written in hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are like a picture writing that Egyptians used. And then the very top register, the second one down, shows 10 decapitated enemies. 10 decapitated. That means their heads are chopped off. And if you look closely, I don't think I can zoom in any bigger. They are laying with their head removed and placed between their legs. So they have the 10 bodies laid out and their heads have been severed off and they are down in between their legs. So here's Narmer himself again, his enemies, his army marching on to victory, his slave again holding his sandals. Down below here, these are two cats of Egypt, and their necks are twisted and unified, representation, the unification of Egypt, which is the northern part of Egypt and the southern part of Egypt. And if you study more about Egypt and the Nile River, it runs backwards. So what they call north and south are actually backwards. That's a whole nother story. But the cats, or the southern and northern part of Egypt, are being unified, and that is representational of the cat's necks twisting. Okay. So Narmer, he conquered another part of Egypt and took over all of it. So before Narmer was king, there were two parts of Egypt. And now Narmer is unifying all of them, and he is going to be ruler of all of it. Scholars believe that this palette told the story of what happened to Narmer and how he conquered all of Egypt and took over. Okay, now we'll go back to Narmer here in a little bit, but I want to ask you this question. What does it mean for something to be ideal? Ideal meaning perfect. Here is an ideal woman of Egypt. Ideal, perfect. She's supposed to be the most beautiful woman of Egypt. Is it kind of like Barbie? To me, Barbie is ideal, right? She is not real. A person isn't of these proportions perfectly, a real human. But Barbie is considered to be an ideal woman, not a real woman. We can also refer it back to this, and if I didn't have a time limit, or we were in Google Meet or something, we could have a discussion how during Paleolithic times, was this considered to be the ideal woman? And if you study the prehistoric slides and things that we talked about during that unit, she was considered to be, this Venus was considered to be the most beautiful woman during that time. And it was ideal for a woman to be this large and have this large of breasts because that was important to them. King Tut, this mask was made to cover his body, or his head in his coffin, so that his soul could be recognized. His soul would recognize his body after he died. And so this mask was put on in an ideal fashion, meaning it made him look a little bit prettier than he really was. So with all this ideal being said, I want you to know that sculptures created during Egyptian times were made to look more ideal than the person really was. Not real. So in other words, if a pharaoh had a huge nose and warts or big lips or whatever it was that was not considered to be nice and pretty during that time, the sculptor would sculpt them to look a little bit better than they really were. So maybe a smaller nose, smaller lips, no warts, that kind of thing. They made them look more ideal. So when we look at this picture of King Tut, or this sculpture of King Tut, this is probably not what he really looked like. It was what he would have looked like in his ideal world, or like what he wanted to look like. So same with this queen here, Queen Nefertiti. This was an example of an ideal bust of this woman. Just like Barbie, what every woman wants to look like, right? No. Don't think so. I want to show you this sculpture. It is called Menkaure and his wife. Menkaure and his wife were pharaohs that ruled Egypt during part of this time. And one of the Great Pyramids of Giza are named after Menkaure. Sculpture during this time was very cubic. So if you notice it was carved out of a block. It was very simplified. And both the man and the woman are the exact same height, or at least darn close. And we know today that men are probably a lot taller than women are. They are in general. And so the situation here probably wasn't real. It was more ideal to make them both be of, I don't know, like an equal block inside here so that they fit together equally. Whether or not women were considered unequal to the pharaoh, I doubt. The pharaoh was probably much more important than his wife. But again, they wanted them both to look pretty. And here's a close-up of it. I like looking up close and seeing how smooth this is and how this is polished and the stone is made gorgeous. I want to point out on the sculpture that 1 foot is forward, 1 foot is moved forward to help balance the sculpture. As you and I both know, if you've heard of something being top heavy, is where all the detail work put at the top, and if the feet come down very, very narrow at the bottom, kind of like the Venus that I showed you earlier, it would have toppled over. So the sculpture wouldn't have been able to stand still. So they move 1 foot forward to help with that balance. Other sculptures were made of pharaohs as well. Here is Khafre, here is Khufu. Those are also pharaohs from the Egyptian. If you go to Giza and go visit the pyramids, that's who the Great Three Pyramids, are named after. The last sculpture that I want to show you, never mind, one more. This next sculpture I want to show you is Queen Nefertiti. This is Queen Nefertiti, and she was sculpted during the New Kingdom. And this is a bust made of limestone. She's about, 19 inches tall. She's the wife of Akhenaten. Akhenaten was a pharaoh during the time period where he only believed in one god. He worshiped the sun god. Well, backing up, people didn't have one god during Egyptian times. They had many, many gods. Here is a synopsis, or a bunch of them here, where you can see the representational of the human with a mask of some sort on top of them, and all of these different pharaohs, or all of these different gods, were representational of different things. So in other words, if you wanted to worship the sun and the ability that the sun has, you would worship Ra, the sun god. Isis was in charge of something else. Horus was on something else. Anubis was like a jackal, and he was representational of death. Osiris was like this queen woman, where during Egyptian times, if you wanted to have a baby, you would pray to Osiris. So going back to Queen Nefertiti, her husband was Akhenaten. He didn't believe in all of these different gods. He didn't pray to them, refused. So he was not very popular during the Egyptian times. And he only prayed to one god, the sun god Ra. Here is a profile of Queen Nefertiti. Here is Pharaoh Akhenaten, her husband. Here's a relief sculpture of Akhenaten. Here's another one that I find to be really, really cool, that is supposed to be Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti, and they're holding the baby and another child. Who's their baby? Their baby is King Tut. This guy, King Tut. This is King Tut's death mask. It was sculpted in 1327 BC. King Tut was a young boy when he became king, and he died at age 18. He loved gold. Everything that he had gold in it. I need to keep going. You can pause this if you need the information. But something happened when King Tut was buried at a young age. He was buried with all of his golden possessions. And in 1922, this archaeologist named Howard Carter found an entrance in some rubble, and he found King Tut's tomb. Later on, Howard Carter got very, very sick, and his boss also got very, very sick, and they both died of blood poisoning, which was said to be a curse from disturbing the king. I think that's kind of cool. And there are tons of photographs in museums of King Akhenaten. If you go through King Tut's tomb, you would walk through the staircase, through the passageway, and the passageway is where visitors could worship the king, and then you would go back to the burial chamber. People were not allowed back there, only priests. And then, of course, King Tut had a great treasury with all of his possessions in it, and in that great treasury were his coffins. He had 3 of them that encased his body. Lots and lots of jewelry was found, and furniture encased in gold. And the lid of his chest also had lots of decoration. Bye.